All right, welcome everybody. Code to Freak, episode 34, first stream in a while. It's gonna be a little bit different than past streams. It's not gonna be everything done on screen. So if you are watching these on YouTube, please do comment on whether you like this format or not. It makes a huge difference to know what people think about it, and so many are comment shy. Um, in an ideal world, I will get more comments than I get likes or dislikes. It will help a great deal. So what is going to be different is that because I suspect that we're towards the very end of the season and we're sort of entering that stage where audiences enduring nodding fatigue. There's only so many nodes you can watch somebody connect port by port. Um, and I think that we've explained the basic principles of symmetry and the math behind it well enough to move on with it. What I've done is I've actually put on my website, if you go on codetofreak.com in the resources pages, season 1, you will find the Day034 scene, which is actually what I'm going to move on after this one, after I explain where we were. And that is actually the working symmetry for most of the rig. It's for you to look at and dissect. I will explain from that scene on stream. And I just don't want to spend another 2 hours noodling the thing together, so I spent, maybe an hour working on my own, putting it together, making notes and so on. There's tabs for the various phases of it. Hello. My daughter woke up. And yeah, let me know if this kind of thing works for you. It's more concise, more explanatory, and less doing. Because I don't believe that what we would have been doing is anything new. So the scene as we had it on at the end of Day033, I think was pretty much like this. And what we did was getting the controls to symmetrize, and that worked well enough. Now, that is not enough to symmetrize a component, so we are going to explain quickly the inside out or the outside in kind of work that we normally do to do something like that, and stages that I'm going to go through next. So we say before, and let's say that we're working on the leg component, that we have several things that we consider part of our interface. And we say that we have the controls, the input, which is supposed to be what other components feed into the component that we're working on, and nothing more, nothing less. And we have the output, which is how this component talks to other components, and never anything else. Now, what we have done, and when people do symmetry or mirroring or reflecting, whatever you want to call it, it's important to remember what your intentions are, which is your intentions are supposed to only affect these. So what you want to do is simply and solely make it so that animators can change the way they manipulate things. Now, there's some other details to it, such as if you're instrumenting the rig, like you're writing animation mirroring tools, having a reflected component makes things easier. Because to reflect rotations, when you have this reflected scale, these reflected matrices on one side, you can literally grab the function curves from one, copy them, and connect them to the other, and voila, the animation is now symmetrical. So with FK, which is also hierarchy dependent, not having to bake things in word space and then bake them down to a different local space again is super convenient. For IK, reflection, so for anything word space, reflection tends to be relatively easy because most of the time they will only matter in terms of translation, but it gets trickier when you have rotation. That's nor here nor there, so we're not really going to be talking about that. But at the end of the day, the point is that there's a very important part, which is controls. That is what you're after, whether the tools manipulate how those controls are driven, or whether the manipulators that the animators use are of concern. It's the same thing. The problem with doing something like this, and some viewer, towards like watched episode 33 and asked in a comment, about what about the interpolation, doesn't that break it? Yes, it does. So we need to work on that, and that's what the example scene well, not so much the example scene as much as the scene that we are going to be using, the scene that I provided, Day034, basically fixes, and that's what we're going to discuss. Sorry for that scratchy morning throat. So that isolation of, and keeping in mind what you want to do and how you want to do it and all of that is pretty important. With all of that said, now, what happens in here is also of concern. So what is going to be going on if inside here you have some parameter that inverts the handedness in here, and that basically takes your controls, inverts the handedness, not really one divided by, let's say that it's reciprocal like that, and now that is the inversion of the control. Everything that you had before in here, you know, your deforming bones or whatever it was actually expecting these controls to blend with. Now, and this is the case because your FK is now inverted, but your IK is actually not seeing that inversion. Your IK is still plain. So what is being produced from here is now different, very different than what is being produced from here. So the blend is now basically ineffective. And that's normally the first thing that you want to figure out and fix. So again, this is the outside inwards approach that I've mentioned several times. You also have one other stage, which is, okay, if something else is receiving these, is that thing also negatively scaling capable? Do we need to sync it and so on? But solving this part is going to be a lot more helpful. Now, if we have solved something like this and the controls work, now you can see that I have the diagnostic bones working. These will work. This is in guide mode now, and remember that you want to check both in guide and non-guided mode to make sure that you are affecting all the right bits. And the main difference is this is the IK, so it's not reflecting, and this is the FK, which I have wiggled plenty. Whoops, not that one. This is the IK, which have the FK, which have wiggled plenty, and that is reflected. Now, also make sure, and this is also important, that you get the expected behavior out of whatever is coming in. So remember, in the same vein, that you might actually be having something coming from the inputs here that you were using, and the IK is going to be fine, so you don't want to, you know, flat out invert everything that comes in, but that same thing is potentially going to need to be mediated somehow before it goes in there. And we had done a little bit of that. The guide is one such thing that sits in this area, so we worked on that. Now, the next bit is, yeah, I reckon it's pretty simple. So we've talked about the maps involved in something like that. And this is going to be, I reckon, pretty important if I can select the color. We have said that once you choose an inversion that you're interested in, a reflection that you're interested in, all that happens is that basically the negative scale changes the handedness of the matrix. If you don't remember these, like peruse episode 33 again, there's no such thing as negative scaling per se. If you accept that scale can really be negative, or if you accept that a negative scale is just an inversion and then a positive scale, what you're really doing is, if you have a right-handed matrix, you know, remember X, Y, Z, you're turning it into a left-handed matrix. The problem with something like that is that before, this was producing for Maya, when you go out to anything that is in the scene in some local space, you're producing Euler transformations. You're producing a set of three angles. Now, your matrices don't really know which axis you've scaled. They only know if they're left or right-handed. And again, you know, have a look at 33, refresh your memory if you don't know what I'm talking about. But they can't know that you just wanted to invert the X, unless in your handedness negation you're also tracking that, but it becomes more complicated than necessary. So what happens is that now the winding of angles of some transformation that you had applied, which is going to be made of like in a precise order. It's basically made of like, oh, push something down, this is the Z, push something down the Z. So roll the Z like that, or rotate something around the Y. If you do Z and then Y like that, you end up with that transform. But if you change that thing, you do Y and then Z, you can see that you end up with a very different transform. So the order of rotation also matters. The angles might need negating, one or two of them might need negating. You can choose to do it on paper if you understand the process. You can do a little bit of it empirically. I think I've shown both things in the previous episode. But the important bit, and the reason why I'm mentioning this, is that as in your process here, you basically go from some input to a matrix through some assorted operations as you do various things, and then eventually you get a matrix again, and then finally with some decomposition or some operation like that, you get a rotation. Your inversion, and I'm not going to say if possible, because if you don't do this you're going to be in trouble, your inversion should take place entirely in here and should be undone by the way you're done with this stage. So you're usually going to have something, and this might be a word transform, so this might be a word matrix that you're receiving from your inputs, or this might in fact be a rotation that's going through a composed matrix. Whatever comes in here is gonna likely be of one-handedness, the one that's common throughout all of Maya, and your operations have to take place in there. Now, why am I harping on these? So, because it's probably the first thing that I see people doing wrong when they start approaching the problem like this. They get some distance and then they have to start doing convoluted things here and there to spottily change things, and then they negate an angle here and something there. Now, I've also shown how in some cases, especially if you're constrained like on a plane or something like that, you can often just negate an angle and you will be fine. That will be a valid reflection, but that is generally not a valid method for everything. So sure, you can change the rotation order of something, just negate the one angle that you want to be, the one angle on the one axis that you want to be mirrored on, and that will often work. Use it as a last resort, use it as a special case. So it's the very top or the very end of something. Very top is best usually, because the very end of something is going to be affected by other things. And whenever possible, work in this space. Enough blabbering. What am I talking about? So chat not super populous today. This is a sudden stream with like 20 minutes notice. Let me know if this is making sense. If it's not, let me know what you want to know. Now, one thing we have done is we got the handedness sign to know, is this positive or negative scaling? And I'm using terms interchangeably, even if I've warned that some of them are incorrect. Now, our trick here is being using a float condition to generate -1 and 1. And from that, we're generating a matrix with that scale negated, and we're using it as the first part in many multiplications. Now, these, I've shown how to use it, I've shown why I do it. Remember, matrix multiplication, almost always it will be your first term, because if you apply it afterwards, it gets pretty weird. If you apply it at the very end of something, it's basically gonna be equivalent to it being the terminus of that entire chain of transforms that you want to apply. If you want the entire chain of transforms to be flipped like that, when all the inputs are actually non-negated, it's gotta be the first term. That's matrix multiplications. I think we've probably done enough of it in the pilot season that if this is unclear, I will recommend you go back and you watch those episodes again. Now, this is the part that we had before and was already working. We're getting that handedness, we're multiplying a control by it, and this is our negatively scale. It's our handedness inverted matrix, and then we use it for a bunch of things. Now, that also gets, I imagine, yeah, this is a decompose. That goes into a blended rotation, and it gets blended with something else, which is the heat rotation. Now, remember that as you do something like that, the output rotate here, this doesn't know negatively scaled or not. So in the same vein that I was talking about this, it doesn't really matter whether you keep, if you're just going out to rotation, whether you keep everything that you were doing here, or if you keep everything that you were doing here or here, but don't mix and match. Don't start negating, you know, renegating, negating again, and so on. Isolate things. Now this gets us our blended rotation for the first joint. Because it's just a rotation, you don't see any weird artifacts. And this is where I was showing, I believe, changing the rotation order and inverting an angle, but we'll have to see if that's the case. Where it gets a little bit more interesting, and this is, if you open that scene, this is where you can see things like reframed. And I haven't often used multiplications with long chains, but remember that a hierarchy is basically just a bunch of matrix multiplications. So this is perfectly viable. You could have 12 items in there, and you're basically emulating going down a hierarchy. This is where things get a little bit more interesting. Now, because we're inverting a matrix, and because what we were doing in here is we have things parented, so this control kind of inherits the negative scaling from this. It doesn't need a lot of work. But as we were going out to the blends, we need to reparent things in the space of the blend. So we're getting the stuff from the IK, we're getting the stuff from the FK, grabbing them in word space and manually reparenting them through multiplications and so on. Something that has changed in this graph is that before, for these operations here, for this reframed matrix that goes into my joint, and this will be the second, yes, I was grabbing the word matrix from this, and then I was multiplying it by the inverse of this word matrix, which is basically the equivalent of saying, hey, I want this transform in this space as if it was the child. And that got us what we wanted. It was all good. Now, the problem you're going to have with that is that when you start looking at word scales, that might or might not work for you, because remember, sorry, word matrices, that might or might not work for you, because you might not necessarily know the receiving handedness, or in this case, we know that this is differently handed than what we had here. And that is why all the work, because from this one to this one, we're only transmitting rotation. This bone is not negatively scaled. So when we do that trick, this is negatively scaled and child is something negatively scaled. Sorry, this is negatively scaled because it's a child of something negatively scaled. This is positively scaled, child of something positively scaled. This one to this one, we were just getting the rotation. The scaling was not really affecting the operations. If we were to straight up just connect these, the scaling will be off. Actually, maybe I should demonstrate that. So if I remove, oh, do I want to do it? This is kind of tricky. I'm debating whether I want to do it or not. Yeah, actually, let's do it. Let's demonstrate. So if I was to use our original setup, which takes the word inverse matrix from this, something will go terribly pear-shaped. Now, why is that? Because this was our original setup, and this is why you need to fix things in that space. The reason for that is exactly what I was talking about, and you can see that there's still some relationship between these controls. That my scholars might not be making it super intuitive, but yeah, hopefully you can spot it. And what is going on is exactly what I was talking about. And if I do this, you know, you can see there's some odd mirroring between their behaviors. The reason for that is that I am now receiving something in terms of this control that has been negated, I am grabbing a handedness matrix in here and kind of unnegating it, I guess. But then I'm multiplying it by the inverse of something that is negated, if that makes sense. So there's this odd mix of handedness, and that's why I'm saying do and undo your handedness in the right space. So once you have something like this and these unhanded matrix, which I have now been using to avoid doing damage, so this is the one that's actually going into the blend here and so on. Now, what you have to remember in this is that before you could just grab this word inverse and it would have been accurate. Now you are mixing operations, you grab the unhanded matrix. This is a matrix inversion node, inverse matrix, it's part of the factory nodes. You have to use that. So you have to be careful about transmitting the right values. Now, it's a question that is probably worth answering now. Is there a benefit to doing the negation inside the component edge over using the underwood? Yes, you want to do it inside the component edge. The underwood would only gets you from, I don't know, here to here. Inside the component, this is inside the component, the control is what you want to affect. So you can't but do it inside the component, because you want this thing to now have the wrong handedness, wrong in terms of how it will mix with others. So, first note, working inside here means that once you start having your handedness inverted matrix and one day you have unhandedness ed or whatever, everywhere you were using the inverse of that or something like that, you might need to use the inverse of these. So with all of that mix in mind, what we've done, handedness, we grab these. Remember that we need to mix these with the IK, which is not being scaled negatively. So this has a negative scale. Let's display that. And it's inherited by this. So to mix it with the IK and keep the rotations in check, then we basically multiply, we pre-multiply by that same handedness, which inverts it again, and that gets us the rotation in a word space that is compatible with the blend node that is going in there, that is also receiving from the IK. It gets trickier when you get down here, because this node basically had a parent-like influence. Backhanded, yeah, backhanded is possibly correct. Remember that as you are unhanding that elsewhere, it means that you also have to process that into the inversion. So if you're using just the inversion of that, that is now the inversion of your negatively scaled one. You don't want to do it as you go into the blend, because it has to talk to something that is not negatively scaled. So I don't know if there's a lot more than I can say about these. It's a lot of talking and it's a lot of wiggling notes around, but open the scene from before, whatever you had. Try to do it yourself. You basically, a good exercise to figure out whether you understood it or not, or a good exercise to practice this and make sure you have understood it or that you're developing that understanding, is basically answering the question that was asked in the comments, which is, yes, these joints that we were blending into, that we're using kind of as our output in a way, these will be broken. These are not made to receive something that has not been fixed. In their base state, let's break this scene and then I can reload it. They would have looked like this, and then where is the inversion? There you go. Or the inverse matrix would have been used like that. And you can still see a relationship between your controls and these, but you can also see that as you blend between the two, we can also show that you are now out of luck. That's what's going on, and the silly purple in my is possibly not gonna help us. So let me copy tab and deselect. that is the blend going wrong. So you need to fix it. This is, when I was symmetrizing the controls or mirroring the controls or whatever, I was not showing these bones. I mean, I knew what was going on. I just wanted to explain it later. We're now at that point. This is what is going on. Your blend is being received by these two nodes. Fix that. To fix that, remember that they're receiving from these blends. Remember that one of the two inputs, the one that is coming from the IK, is not negatively scaled, and it has to stay that way. Not that you can negatively scale that and leave the FK alone if that was easier, but we'll get to that in a second. But I suggest that you leave that exactly as it is. Find the edges of your problem. So find the moment where you get the FK in and everything that you extract from the FK and fix that. So you will, and I'm giving you the recipe here, but if you can figure it out on paper, it's probably, or even empirical, it's probably going to be better for you. You want to uninvert the first control, and that is basically remultiplying by the handedness matrix. That's my daughter's motorbike. And change that to be the input matrix that we decompose. Come on, do me a solid, Maya, connect that. And that will fix the first bone. The second one will be a little bit trickier. And it's where you kind of got to go, you know, if you had just taken that and pushed it somewhere, it wouldn't have done you any good. You will find that the word inverse was connected. You can't just unhand that or some, well, you kind of can. It's sort of what we're doing here in a way, I guess. But you can't take the inversion and unhand it. It's probably not going to end well. You want to remember that this is what you had unhanded. And that is what you basically want to connect in there. And if you add longer chains, you might find, and if you start composing longer sets of multiplications to re-parent all of these things, so to go towards space and then parent back together again, you might find that they sort of add incrementally. So you start having from a 2 to a 3, then to a 4, and so on. It's not a lot of work because this component can actually last you for a long time. This doesn't change, and your handedness is now configurable. All right. Enough belaboring that. That is really what I wanted to get across for this episode in terms of doing. So instead of doing an hour of noddling, hopefully these 30 minutes of explanation has been a useful replacement and more concise. What is next after that? Now I say you could negate the IK, and it will be a little bit easier than having to unnegate the FK. Why would it be easier? Mostly because the IK is a pretty simple solution the way we've done it. It's giving you one top item, which is not different in many ways than what we're dealing with this first FK control. But then the second item, the second item that governs the IK is, you know, the input here is just positional, so you can pretty much ignore it. The second one is just an angle. Our input from the IK is this angle between these two bones, and it will be a lot easier to negate that than to do all the reparenting and stuff that we're doing with the FK. The reason why I recommend you do the FK instead is that if you fixed the IK so that you have these aligned handedness, and your controls will be the way you wanted them anyway. Your problem is that you might, if you let the FK drive the base state of the bones or whatever they are, and you bend the IK into submission, these bones that you're likely also going to be using for the forming will be negatively scaled, will be handed differently than what Maya expects, and some tools might not like it. God knows, I mean, the scripts out on the internet are usually very poorly written, so if you use any of those, I can't think of many that make concessions for like checking the handedness and the winding orders and the winding direction of angles and so on. So if you can make the entirety of your process just a small configurable set of changes between these conversions so that you always only operate in that matrix space and everything else is positively scaled, that's you, yeah. You're gonna be doing yourself a favor. So that's it for that part. Now the next thing, and there was that question about the underworld, which is actually pertinent, because the next thing that's gonna happen when you do something like that is that what is going out might not be, when you interface with other components, what you wanted it to be. And that's the other part of this work. Let me see. Do I have something good here to show? So there's sorry, my daughter has discovered that she can move the furniture around and slam her hands on it. So the next thing that the component is responsible for is actually going out to other components. And this is that second part I was talking about. So this part here, you might have to address. Now, I don't remember tit for tat everything I did. Hey, welcome. I don't remember tit for tat what I did with this one, but we can have a quick look. Now, in your output, you're going out with chain end. And this is also interesting in some ways. So I've fixed these two bones. This foot here was to stick to the leg, whichever way it's blended, because we want the blending to be something that only happens in the leg and happens all the way to the output, so that the foot does not have to know if it's actually syncing to something that's negatively scaled or the FKIK blending or whatever it is. You don't want that to happen. We are receiving raw parameters in the foot. So we were, and this needs to be de-guided to show that. Let me see, do I have the de-guiding tools? I do, but I might need to load the plugin, and I wish I had done it before the stream. So let me quickly, whoops. Apologies for this, I need to load our plugin. And that's pretty much all there should be to it. So this is the same plugin we've been using in the previous episode of that. It's the one that's available on my GitHub. It's now loaded. That's the one that we use for swaps. Now, again, if you start from the previous episode, what you would have seen, I didn't remember the color for this to be so bad. This is terrible. Let me change that as well. This is kind of stuff I really should have done pre-stream. Did I change it from there? Outliner color. Where is it? Drawing overrides. Yes. Something more readable. Anything more readable will do. Come on. Daughter is being super cute. All right. Slightly more readable. So this is receiving this item, and this item, we said it before, this is the end of our FK chain or whatever it is that we've linked to the foot. It's pretty important, and it's slightly different than the rest again. So it does not, as far as I remember, at least go out to a bone, or does it? It does, actually. That's good. That might make it easier for us to figure stuff out. Do I want to be brave and add that node and see what happens? All of this is pinned. What can possibly go wrong with that anyway? So there you go. Now, the position of that is driven by the tibia length. Ankle blend, so okay, that's cool. We're still on top of this. The position is driven by the tibia length, and that's all good because we don't want anything else to position it for us. It spares us from a bunch of work. The rotations, and this is the whole thing we've been showing it so far. If you can get your, V chain or Z chains or whatever solutions to be just about solving rotations, and the lengths are part of what is being guided, or some stretch up, you're gonna save yourself a world of pain. And that is all we need for the IK, so it goes out into this blend. Similarly, it receives the rotation from the from a blend the way the rest of the bones do. there's the word matrix, the unhanded matrix. You can look up all of these easily enough. Now, the problem with not fixing that, if you had not seen this component, I should say, you will think that just by doing the previous two blends, you would have been okay. And you would have been in for some pain. So the way this was working before, let me make sure I am right, was that it was just being converted like that, and the consequence of it. So this is another component. This is not the one that we were working on. But if you have nothing connected to this one, you're very likely to not notice mistakes such as these. What would have been happening is that, and maybe your default is that you're in IK, everything would have seemed fine until this went out to an animator, they switched to FK, and this flips around. So, as you need to work on this part, because for the most part, this ankle blend here, it's not really going to be used for deformations or anything like that. It is used for us to go out to another component, hook up other components, animate the values or whatever, put yourself in all the possible cases where those transforms matter, and that is, well, that's basically gonna sort you out, I guess. Now, don't remember, there you go, that was the node that was reconnected. So in that case, that's a pretty simple thing, because this FK control, by the way it works, is super straightforward. If we unhand it, because it's going through that chain, and we just use the rotation right away, it should be good, I believe. So let me check that. Yeah. If you want, you can do the maths of how things go down the hierarchy, what axes, you know, get swapped around as they go through the transforms. That's what I ended up doing, because the empirical model only goes that far. Like, it gets pretty laborious to keep track of it. But if you're not up to that level just yet, then just very methodically try and swap and scale and so on. So let's summarize that a little bit. Remember, when you're doing something like that, to isolate what you want to happen. Now, your objective is that the controls behave differently. Some of them, nothing else. Never lose sight of that. You are receiving something that, if you've been doing things the way I've been doing them, should never be oddly handed. You want to output something that is never oddly ended, otherwise this gets broken. This is a circular rule, it should never be broken. Now, some of the stuff you're working on, like the IK, you will probably not want to invert the handedness off, swap the handedness off. So as it goes into a bunch of blends, keep track of all the blends that you're using, keep track of everything that goes to the out, and you will normally find one of the two edges that you need to solve for. Get your controls, which is what we did the last episode, to behave the way you want them to behave. Then reach from those controls to all of the items that might affect the outside world. Find, before you get to all of the matrix to your Euler conversions, or the matrix to translation conversions, whatever it is, compose, decompose if you're using the factory nodes. Find everything in between. Try not to work with directly negating angles unless you're really, really sure about what you're doing and you're doing it up top in a simple fashion, like we've shown how to do for the first bone, I believe. And work in that space. Try to avoid negating angles. Just work with the matrices. You will have your unhanded matrix or whatever it is inserted where needed. Remember that if you were grabbing something from a control like its inverse word and you're inverting the word, you might not be able to use that inverse word any longer in the chain of operations where you are now using the unhanded word. You will probably have, almost assuredly, you will have to take that unhanded part and invert that manually, and that basically becomes the equivalent of what before you would have added as word inverse, and you will get the control to output relationship correct. Now remember that your component doesn't work in a bubble, and this is a mistake I see done all the time. I call it holistic rigging or whatever name you want to give it, but there's a very good reason if when I read you see me introducing as many components and hooking them up and then doing revisions while they're hooked up and guided and so on. And that is not that I enjoy the pain that it is to do that, because it's more that you're juggling, it's more that you have to keep in mind, your scene is more cluttered, it does get more difficult. But mistake number one, I would say, that I see people making is working in a bubble, thinking that they have this nice piece of, rig, this component, they can work on it in isolation. You can, if you're really, really on top of your game, or if the fixes that you need to apply are very tiny and very, nestled up in the middle of it, it's probably not a bad idea. But when you're designing a component or making sweeping changes, connect it to other stuff. Swap the guy, do stuff like that, because it's important to remember that it will affect other components. So there you go. That is all the guidelines that I can think of when it comes to doing this work. Again, if you're watching this on YouTube, let me know in the comments how you feel about these kind of videos. I don't think they're gonna become, the mainstay of how I'm gonna be doing streams. But as we reach a certain level of complexity of the rig, and there's so much modeling work to do and so much repetition in what we do, it seems pretty logical to me once in a while to just do something like this, where I go from the edges of the problem inwards, explaining what I did to solve it. Because the tools of the trade to do it is just loading nodes that are factory nodes and connect them. So remember, the scene is available on code2freak.com, resources season 1, Day034, everything that is in here, including, I believe, the tabs, they should come up. And yeah, I reckon that's it. Chat, help me out. Am I forgetting something, you reckon? Or was something, if you don't think I'm forgetting anything, was something unclear? And if not, we're gonna take questions. And obviously, if you... that's a loud script editor. If you can, and I've done this before putting the scene out, I believe, you should, like, as part of the QC process I've mentioned, remember that if you're doing guiding, live guiding the way I've been doing it, your component sort of has multiple dimensionalities. Something might work guided and not unguided, or vice versa. Runtime, unexpected internal failure, that's always super helpful, whatever it is. Oh, I know what it is. Maybe. Yeah. I forgot that I brought this script to work on a single component at a time. So, it should now have decoupled FK and IK. Now it's in FK mode. The IK is not affecting it anymore. The FK seems to work. Check your blends. Like, it's, if I've been once asked, like, this looks like additional work, it looks like it's gonna get complex and so on. Yes. There's this odd idea that anything can be made infinitely simple until it becomes easy and intuitive. I've been programming and rigging for many years, and that is not my experience or that of anybody I know. Things at one point get complex, and the mental juggling of moving them forward becomes harder, and the sheer amount of mass in terms of nodes and faults and concerns does accrue. That's why you have to practice. You can't just watch my videos and then go into production with it. It might be a bit of a disaster unless you deploy the work very gradually. Can I ask, I haven't seen so many videos. Alright, cheers, man. If you want to ask, so we're in Q&A. If somebody has been, if you've been watching this on YouTube, I reckon the the episode part is done. Miraculously enough, I've managed to keep it concise. 45 minutes. So any questions, go for the next 5 or 10 minutes. Will you be doing some basic skinning on a mesh? Yes, I will. Do you have anything that sticks in your mind as being particularly tricky to solve? millions of things. Can you be a bit more specific, like in what domain? Controls, like what type of component, general problems. And let's make sure that our guide has no effect. No, it doesn't. Will it blend? Yes, it blends. No silly compressions to stuff. That's the other reason for doing everything the way I do it, for me. Not saying it's right. Do whatever you want. But reducing everything to separate lengths and angles gets you these really nice interpolations where nothing has to squeeze through the two spaces. And I will fully expect the vectoring to not be driven by the guide. So there might be something in our guide that is a bit whack that needs work, because this is the guide part of the vector and it's still controlling the vector. That's just fixing the component. But yeah, and you can see that the blend can take a fair bit of punishment. A rig that presents a uniquely difficult challenges. Look, it's I think that, like, where I stand in my career at this point, the the hardest part about rigging, once you get to the point where you've mostly rigged everything that can be rigged in general terms and you're comfortable doing it. So I don't, if I, you know, I mostly do development. I'm a technology supervisor, not a rigger. But I've rigged for a long time, for decades, and I've rigged a lot of stuff, and you get to one point after you do it for long enough, much like in programming, where you don't really have to think about what you're rigging. Like you know you can do it end to end, just fine. The problem is almost always going to be the dialogue with the users, because you can solve incredibly complex problems, but it's often very hard to make that solution. So the way you lay out the controls, the solver underneath, and so on, almost every problem in rigging can be solved, and they're not too hard to solve once you accrue enough knowledge. But getting that to have an interface that animators understand within the constraints of production, it depends on how much teaching and exploration is valued at the company you work in. That's almost always the hardest part, because even if you look at something like dynamics in rigs, they're not hard to implement at all. You can get some really stable solvers, but the problem with forward evaluated dynamics that rely on the previous frame, so stateful ones to get a tail to jiggle or something like that, is that they're forward only. They need the previous frame to actually evaluate. So as you scroll through something, it's good if they scroll forward, but not if they scroll backward, and then they jump frame, and you go like, okay, we can't use, unless there's an agreement with the animators that we can use a time stateful mechanism, and that they're aware of the limitations, we can't use it. Or they go, no, but we really want it, and then you have to develop all these tools to basically cover all these cases of interaction. How people interact with your rig adds several levels of dimensionality to the problem, because it gets really hard to know what state the rig is in, as in, have they checked this box and that box and this box and that box, which is again a super common problem in rigging. If you answer every single animation call, usually you end up with 1500 options, and they interact in odd ways, and you get side effects. It becomes impossible to troubleshoot the components. I'm sure this is a familiar story for everybody who's rigged for long enough. And then the next step is like, oh, can we get rid of all this stuff, please? And then somebody misses it, and some of it was in use. So if you remove it, it breaks the motion that already exists on disk. The problems are almost always in managing the users, because they're also all different. So it's a fuzzy problem as well, which doesn't help. Other than that, yeah, it's, things like IK toes being a nightmare. It's again a user problem, because they're pretty easy to solve. But getting them to work and be intuitive is it's sort of interesting. You will want to do it in a context tool ideally, but again, you have to get people like you have to teach people. Oh, you have to press this shortcut if you want this super cool manipulator, so that you solve in the manipulation space and not in the evaluation space. And then people go, I can't learn another shortcut. I already have 18. Can it be automatic? So unless you have the time to deploy something that on selection also monitors whether that thing is a special manipulator, it gets tricky. Yeah, being on both sides of the negotiation often helps. As a technologist, I usually get along with the people that I provide rigging tools and rigging frameworks for, because I've rigged enough that I usually know what their pain points are. There's always the risk of being presumptuous and going like, oh, I've done this and I've done this for longer than you, or I've done both things, therefore I know better. There's always a human management side of that, which is, it's really hard. It's a juggling act, and it takes a long time to mature those kind of skills, and they're often underappreciated. Like in a lot of interviews, people ask technical questions and or look at demo reel, which I think is utterly useless for rigging, for the record. And they forget to ask people, how do you deal with human beings? Kind of disconnected. How much time do you tend to spend on creating the animator's interface versus focusing on the underlying skin deformation? There's no answer to that. It depends on the creature, it depends on who does the work, it depends on the facility. It depends on the revisions. I would have to look at the averages of several productions to give you an idea, to be honest. And I wouldn't be able, like, I would be legally unable to disclose the averages of a company I work for, so no, that's not gonna happen. So it'd be cool to have everybody's averages. And if you've never been in production, the averages are when you finish a project, you partition the work that's been done and you try and pull out some numbers out of it, and you keep track of various categories of how those numbers have averaged over the various productions, so that everything that comes in, when you work on big VFX movies, on big animation movies, every movie has some new challenges. So you can never go like, oh, we're just redoing this thing we did before. We know exactly how it's done. And there's always an element of novelty to almost anything worth doing, at least up to this point in almost every facility. Or something is clearly recognizable as something you had done before anyway. So what you tend to do, because this newness element repeats itself, it's kind of a constant in a way. So you tend to use averages a lot. You use the averages from the previous show because you go, well, it's not the same work, but the previous work was still that level of challenge and had some new elements to it. This is the same level of challenge, and yes, it has some new elements to it that are not the previous new elements, but the general principle sort of works. Almost every facility of a certain scale that I know of keeps track of averages. Sorry, it's not really an answer to that question, because I don't think it can be easily answered. It changes so much. So that's how a lot of places do it. That's how they deal with figuring out how much they spend on what. And it depends on what you consider skin deformation as well. Muscle systems can complicate things considerably. They need feedback loops with modeling, and do you account for those feedback loop? You should, because their money spent. It's tricky. It gets like when you start working on big productions, the complexity of figuring out how much time, which is how much money ultimately you have spent on things, gets pretty tricky, which is why people resort to simple dumb statistical systems, because it's can't really solve it analytically. All right, I'll give you one more minute for other questions. I'm gonna make a note that I need to fix these. That's probably just something that's gone missing from the I can do it. From the panels that need to delete connections or replace them or whatever, it's just not getting de-guided. But there you go. This is the other thing you want to do. Like, get stuff, and this might actually break now, but get stuff upside down, like seriously mess with things. And obviously, like, you can do with these simple blendings we have, you can do more than 180 degrees, so you will see popping and crap. But do put things upside down, you know, move them 10,000 units away from, whoops, from the center of the board. Make sure you don't have precision problems. Those are, you know, make sure that when you work in a component, you're connected to everything else. Like, it's it will become pretty standard practice. I mean, put yourself in a somewhat realistic situation. Don't work in a bubble. It's probably a conclusion I should have drawn like 15 minutes ago. Anyway, cool. Thanks a lot for attending the stream. The company is really appreciated. Without you guys, this would not exist. If you're watching these on YouTube, thanks a lot for watching. And it's not a ton that we have left to do, I reckon. We still need to do the symmetry for the foot. I might do it off stream. Please do comment on this whole thing of, you know, explaining something that's been done off stream instead of nodding for hours. And then after that, I reckon we can toss a mesh in, and then I'll need somebody to help to get me some animation. Alright, thanks everybody, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.